The hum of the Stardust probe was Reid's constant companion, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated through the deck plating and settled deep in his bones. For 573 days, it had been the sole soundtrack to his existence, a mechanical heartbeat at the farthest reaches of charted space. His quarters, a compact module of brushed alloy and recessed lighting, offered a singular viewport, a portal to an infinite expanse of stardust and nebulae, an indifferent tapestry of cosmic grandeur. Reid began his day as he always did, with meticulous precision. He rose from his integrated sleeping berth at 6 o'clock standard, the internal chronometer displaying the time in crisp, green digits. A brief, efficient stretch, a scan of the environmental controls, oxygen levels stable, temperature nominal, recycling efficient. He then moved to the compact galley, preparing his nutrient paste, a bland, but calorically dense, sustenance. Each action was deliberate, a bulwark against the vast, oppressive silence that lay beyond the hull. Today, however, a subtle discord permeated the routine. As he scooped the paste, the overhead lighting in the galley flickered, a stuttering pulse that lasted barely a second before returning to its steady glow. Reid paused, spoon suspended. He logged it mentally, a minor anomaly. The Stardust was an aging vessel, designed for endurance, not luxury. Small electrical quirks were not unheard of. He finished his meal, then methodically cleaned his utensils, the slight tremor in the overhead lights repeating twice more during the process. His primary task for the cycle was data collation from the long-range sensor arrays. He moved to the command console, a sprawling nexus of screens and holographic displays. The main viewscreen presented the current trajectory, a slow, deliberate crawl through an uncharted sector. Distant galaxies spun like cosmic pinwheels, their light taking millennia to reach the probe. It was a beautiful, terrifying vista, a reminder of his utter insignificance and profound isolation. He initiated the diagnostic sequence for the forward sensor array. The system ran a series of self-checks, the progress bar inching across the screen. As the internal diagnostics neared completion, a flash of static washed across the main display, a brief, violent snowstorm of pixels. When it cleared, the diagnostic report was there, but for a fraction of a second, an impossible image had superimposed itself onto the void's endless black, a glimpse of an interior, dark and cavernous, with rows of empty, velvet-covered seats receding into an indistinct gloom. A marquee, barely legible through the digital distortion, seemed to read old cinema. Reid blinked, leaning closer. The image was gone, replaced by the standard green text of the diagnostic report. No error codes for visual anomalies. The sensor array reported 98% functionality, a slight degradation in the tertiary spectral scanner. He frowned, running a hand over his close-cropped hair. Fatigue, perhaps. He'd been awake for 16 hours, pushing through a software update. The isolation had a way of playing tricks on the mind, blurring the line between perception and reality. He dismissed the flicker of the old cinema as a spurious data artifact, a ghost in the machine's complex wiring. Still, the image lingered, an unsettling detail out of place. He pressed on, determined. The tertiary spectral scanner required recalibration. It was a delicate procedure, demanding his full attention. He accessed the maintenance protocols, his fingers flying across the holographic interface. Each step was carefully considered, each parameter adjusted with precision. The Stardust was his responsibility, his only connection to the world he had left behind. Failure was not an option. Hours passed. The hum of the probe persisted, punctuated now by the occasional, almost imperceptible, stutter of the internal lighting. The tertiary scanner recalibrated, its output data stream returning to nominal values. Reid leaned back, a sigh escaping him. Another problem resolved. He felt a fleeting sense of accomplishment, quickly swallowed by the omnipresent vastness outside. He glanced at the main view screen again. Different. He knew the risks of deep space missions, the psychological toll. He was prepared for it, or so he told himself. Yet, the memory of the old cinema, so jarringly terrestrial, so utterly out of place against the backdrop of cosmic dust, gnawed at the edges of his resolve. It was a trivial anomaly, a glitch, nothing more. Reid reached for the internal comms, intending to log the minor electrical fluctuations. The Stardust probe, for all its colossal mass, felt suddenly fragile. Reid felt it in the deck plating, a tremor that wasn't the usual resonant thrum, but something sharper, an irregular pulse. He had been monitoring the deep space telemetry, the endless stream of data that confirmed the probe's existence at the edge of the charted void. 573 days, and the machinery had become an extension of his own nervous system, its operational integrity his personal barometer of reality. Then, the first flicker. It wasn't on the primary display, but a secondary environmental monitor, showing atmospheric pressure within habitation unit gamma. A momentary burst of static, like a forgotten broadcast signal, then a return to the steady green numbers. Reid blinked, leaning closer. Fatigue, he decided. The constant low light, the drone of the life support, the endless, unchanging starfield through the main viewport, it all conspired to play tricks on the optic nerve. He rubbed his eyes, the gritty sensation of familiar protest from his overtaxed body. He returned to the primary console, a bank of 5 high-resolution screens displaying stellar cartography, probe diagnostics, and long-range sensor feeds. He was charting a newly discovered nebula, a vast, incandescent cloud that hung like spilled paint across the cosmic canvas. His fingers danced across the holographic interface, calling up spectral analyses and gravitational flux readings. The numbers scrolled, precise and predictable, for a moment. Then, the star chart on screen 3 began to ripple. Not a visual distortion, but the actual coordinates shifting, subtly at first, then with increasing erraticism. A cluster of known protostars, catalogued and confirmed, seemed to migrate across the display, their positions defying established orbital mechanics. Reid frowned, a deep crease forming between his brows. He tapped the screen, then punched in a command for a system-wide recalibration of the optical sensors. The probe's internal systems whirred, a mechanical sigh, then reported optimal function. He cross-referenced the data with the probe's internal chronometer and its last confirmed positional fix. The discrepancy was immediate and jarring. According to the current sensor feed, the probe was observing a constellation that, by all astronomical reckoning, should have been hundreds of light-years away, in a completely different sector. Not only that, but the arrangement of its primary stars was subtly wrong, like a familiar face viewed through a distorting lens. A star he knew to be a red dwarf glowed with the blue intensity of a supergiant, another, a gas giant, was absent entirely, replaced by a tight binary system. System error, he muttered, the words tasting like dust. He reran the diagnostic suite, this time focusing on the astrogation array. No faults. He initiated a full reboot of the primary sensor cluster, a process that would take 15 minutes and momentarily blind the probe to its surroundings. He leaned back in his pilot's chair, the synthetic leather creaking softly. This was more than just a glitch. This was an outright contradiction. As the reboot counter ticked down, Reid pulled up archived stellar data, comparing it meticulously to the live feed he'd just witnessed. The archived data was solid, immutable. The live feed, however, was a phantom. He was a deep space surveyor, his entire existence revolved around the absolute truth of observation. If his instruments lied, what then? The 15 minutes crawled. The probe's hum seemed to deepen, a lower, more guttural resonance. It wasn't a flicker of static this time. It was a complete displacement. The endless, star-dusted blackness of deep space vanished, replaced by an interior. Dusty, velvet seats, rows upon rows, stretched into a cavernous gloom. The air was thick with the scent of stale popcorn and forgotten decades. A projection beam, weak and wavering, cast a faint glow from a booth high in the back. A faded crimson curtain, frayed at the edges, hung before a screen that was blank, expectant. It was an old cinema, impossibly detailed, impossibly present. Reid's breath hitched. His eyes, accustomed to the infinite, struggled to comprehend the sudden, finite space. The illusion lasted only a few seconds, perhaps 5 at most, before the viewport snapped back to the familiar, terrifying expanse of the cosmos. He pushed himself away from the console, stumbling back a step. His hand flew to his comms unit, then dropped. Who would he report this to? He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly. Isolation, he thought, desperately. Extreme fatigue. The brain, deprived of novel stimuli, begins to create its own. But the star chart, the impossible stellar alignments, those were objective readings. They weren't just in his head. He walked over to the viewport, pressing his palm against the cool, smooth surface. He stared out at the indifferent galaxy, searching for any lingering trace, any telltale distortion. Nothing. The malfunctions were no longer simple hardware issues. The machine, his companion for nearly 600 days, was not just broken. It was showing him something that defied definition, something that chipped away at the very foundations of what he understood to be real. And the universe, vast and empty, seemed to watch him with an unfamiliar, unsettling gaze. The irregular pulse that had seized the Stardust probe a moment ago now seemed to resonate within Reid's own bones. He pressed a palm against the cool metal of the control panel, feeling the faint, erratic thrum against his skin. It wasn't the rhythmic vibration of the probe's propulsion systems, nor the gentle shudder of the hull adjusting to thermal shifts. This was a deeper, more unsettling beat, like a colossal heart struggling to maintain rhythm. No anomalies. No microfractures, no pressure fluctuations, no unusual energy signatures. The probe was, by all objective metrics, perfectly sound. Yet, the tremor persisted, a phantom vibration that seemed to emanate not from the ship, but from the vast emptiness beyond the viewport. Then came the sound. At first, it was barely perceptible, a low, resonant hum that seemed to slip beneath the whine of the life support and the software of the environmental controls. Reid paused, cocking his head. He cycled through the internal audio feeds, isolating each subsystem, then cutting them one by one. The hum remained, a persistent, almost felt presence. It wasn't a frequency he recognized from any of the probe's operational parameters. It was too deep, too pervasive. He tried to pinpoint its origin, moving slowly through the central command module, then into the adjoining habitat section. The sound seemed to swell and recede with his movements, yet never localized. It was everywhere and nowhere, a vibration in the air, in the deck plating, in the very silence between his thoughts. Environmental harmonics, he murmured to himself, his voice sounding thin in the pervasive hum. All clear. His determination, usually a solid anchor, began to fray at the edges. The hum intensified, growing in complexity. It wasn't just a drone now, faint, fragmented whispers seemed to rise within its depths. They were indistinct, like voices caught on a distant, failing radio frequency, too garbled to decipher. Yet, there was a cadence to them, an unsettling rhythm that suggested language, meaning, intent. Reid clenched his jaw. Isolation psychosis. It was a known risk for deep space missions. The mind, starved of external stimuli, began to generate its own. Auditory hallucinations were a classic symptom. He knew this. He had trained for this. He moved to his personal terminal, pulling up his psychological profile and a self-assessment protocol. He began to input data, sleep patterns, irregular, but manageable, stress levels, elevated, but controlled, cognitive function tests, still sharp, despite the fatigue. His mind felt lucid, rational. He was Reid, a surveyor, not a man succumbing to phantoms. They were no longer just fragments, now they seemed to coalesce, forming an impression of sound, a collective, drawn-out sigh. It was a sound he knew, though it shouldn't exist here. His vision blurred, and the familiar geometry of the probe's interior rippled, twisting at the edges. He was no longer in the probe. The air hung heavy with the scent of dust, stale popcorn, and something metallic, like ancient rust. The stage, where a screen should have been, was a gaping maw, a black hole of impossible depth. They were everywhere now, a chorus of hushed voices, not quite human, not quite animal. They moved around him, through him, brushing against his consciousness. But they were a river of sound, a torrent of meaning without form, a language of pure presence. It was as if this place, this memory, had been waiting for him, carefully constructed in the recesses of his mind, now brought forth by the alien hum. Not spoken, but felt, a resonant vibration that seemed to pluck at the very strings of his being. He squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his hands to his ears. The hum didn't diminish. He was not hallucinating. This was not a product of his isolation. Something was speaking to him, and it was using his own mind as its conduit. He was losing control. The erratic pulse from the Stardust probe continued its faint, irregular thrum against Reid's palm, a vibration that seemed to translate directly into the marrow of his bones. He retracted his hand, the cool metal of the control panel offering no solace. The internal diagnostics, displayed across 3 primary screens, flickered with an unfamiliar latency. Data streams, usually crisp and immediate, now lagged, their numerical sequences stuttering like a broken projector reel. He leaned forward, adjusting the magnification on the central monitor. What he expected was a stable readout of the probe's structural integrity, but instead, the schematic of the Stardust shifted. A bulkhead, typically rendered as a straight, unwavering line, now possessed a subtle, almost imperceptible curve. It was not a rendering error, the line itself seemed to breathe, its geometry expanding and contracting with a slow, deliberate rhythm. Reid blinked, pressing his knuckles into his eyes. When he looked again, the line was straight, immutable. He dismissed it as optical fatigue, a trick of the light in the confined space. Yet, the anomaly persisted. On the auxiliary screen, monitoring external sensor data, the starfield began to distort. The distant pinpricks of light, usually static and predictable, started to elongate, stretching into impossible ellipses that then snapped back into perfect points. Then, a more profound alteration, a section of the black void, perhaps a quarter of the display, suddenly rendered in a spectrum of colors Reid had never witnessed. Not infrared or ultraviolet, but hues that defied categorization, gradients that bled from a shimmering, unearthly violet into a deep, resonant ochre, then into something akin to silence made visible. He ran a diagnostic sweep of the optical sensors, then the internal display drivers. All systems reported nominal. He accessed the raw sensor feeds directly, bypassing the display's interpretation. The raw data, a stream of numerical values, remained consistent. The distortion was not in the input, nor in the output. It was in his perception of the output. He shifted his gaze from the monitors to the primary viewport. The vast, inky expanse of space lay before him, an eternal canvas of stars. But at the extreme edge of his peripheral vision, where the viewport's frame met the interior wall of the probe, he caught a fleeting glimpse. A structure. It was not a star, nor a nebula, nor any celestial body he recognized. It was a shape composed of angles that twisted inward upon themselves, surfaces that folded and unfolded without apparent depth, a geometry that defied Euclidean principles. It was gone before he could fully turn his head, replaced by the mundane curve of the probe's interior. A knot tightened in his stomach. He was not merely tired. This was beyond fatigue. He pushed himself away from the console, needing to move, to confirm the solidity of his surroundings. He walked the short perimeter of the command module. The deck plating, usually a flat, unyielding surface, seemed to undulate subtly beneath his boots. The overhead lighting panels, fixed firmly to the ceiling, appeared to sag, their edges softening, blurring. The very air felt thicker, as if the probe itself was breathing around him. He reached the access hatch to the rear section, his hand resting on the cool metal. For a single, disorienting moment, the polished steel of the hatch shimmered, dissolving into the worn, velvet-covered double doors of an old cinema. The faint scent of dust and stale popcorn, an echo from a forgotten memory, filled his nostrils. The air was heavy, hushed, expectant, as if waiting for a film to begin. He could almost hear the distant murmur of an unseen audience, a low, collective sigh. The illusion was so complete, so vivid, that he instinctively reached out, expecting to push through the heavy doors. The cinema vanished, replaced by the familiar, claustrophobic reality of the Stardust. Reid gasped, pulling his hand back as if burned. His breath hitched in his throat. This was not a glitch. This was not fatigue. His perception was being actively manipulated, his reality dismantled piece by piece. The universe, or something within it, was not merely broadcasting, it was sculpting his experience, bending the very fabric of his environment to its incomprehensible will. His vision blurred for a moment, the diagnostic readouts dissolving into a shimmering pattern that resembled a spider web spun from liquid light. He blinked, the image receding, but the residual disorientation lingered. He needed to check the auxiliary environmental controls, a redundant system located in a rarely accessed section of the probe's lower deck. The route was circuitous, through service tunnels that usually remained dark and inert. As he navigated the narrow passages, the usual hum of life support systems seemed to recede, replaced by a low, persistent static that permeated the very air. The passage eventually opened into a larger, cavernous space that was never meant to exist in the probe's schematics. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of dim light filtering from an unseen source high above. Rows of tattered velvet seats, their fabric faded and torn, stretched before him, converging towards a vast, dark screen. This space was not part of the Stardust probe. Reid moved cautiously down the aisle, his boots crunching on unseen debris. They were not words, not precisely, but a cacophony of overlapping frequencies, each carrying a sliver of incomprehensible information. He stopped halfway down the aisle, his gaze fixed on the screen. It was not blank. Impossible geometries swirled across its surface, shifting, reforming, collapsing into themselves with an unnerving fluidity. Lines of force, not light, pulsed from the center, bending the very air around them into visible distortions. As Reid watched, a particular pattern emerged, a spiraling vortex of non-Euclidean angles that seemed to draw his focus with an almost magnetic pull. He felt a strange compulsion to lean closer, to decipher the impossible logic. He raised a hand, unconsciously reaching out towards the screen. The moment his fingers extended, the swirling geometries on the screen seemed to react. The vortex pulsed, not randomly, but in direct response to his movement. It deepened, its colors shifting from an indistinct gray to a bruised violet, then to a sickening ochre. This was not a malfunction. This was a response. He retracted his hand sharply, a jolt of fear running through him. Coincidence? A trick of the light? But the light itself seemed to be a product of the screen, not an external source. He took a hesitant step back, and the vortex on the screen seemed to flatten slightly, its furious motion easing. Another step back, and the ochre faded, replaced by the original indistinct gray. A horrifying connection solidified in his mind. The anomalies were not random. They were intelligent. They were responsive. The Stardust probe wasn't just malfunctioning, it was being manipulated. They didn't form words, but they congealed into a terrifying, alien voice that communicated not with sound, but with concepts and feelings directly implanted into his consciousness. He felt, rather than heard, the immense, unfathomable age of the entity. Then came the true horror, a concept of hunger. Not for sustenance as he knew it, but for something more fundamental, more abstract. It was a cosmic consumption, an unraveling of order, a dismantling of reality. The voice conveyed the feeling of being observed, not by an individual, but by an entire universe that was not merely vast and empty, but actively, malevolently aware. It was a predator, and the probe, his isolated vessel, was merely a lure, a conduit. Reid's breath hitched in his throat. His knees buckled, and he gripped the back of a nearby seat to steady himself, his knuckles white against the worn velvet. He was not just isolated at the edge of known space, he was being consumed from within. He was its target. Now, the cool metal offered no solace, and the screen offered no truth. A ripple, like heat haze over asphalt, passed across the display. The numerical readouts blurred, then reformed into something else entirely. Reid stared, his breath catching. It was a face he didn't recognize, yet a dread settled in his chest as if he had known it intimately, known its particular brand of ruin. The images flickered with increasing speed, like frames from an ancient film reel skipping in a faulty projector. The probe's low thrum, a familiar vibration in the deck plates, deepened, gaining a resonant, almost organic quality. It was no longer a machine's hum, but a guttural drone that seemed to vibrate directly within his inner ear. The metallic walls of the control cabin began to shimmer. The sharp angles of the equipment softened, the industrial gray giving way to a mottled, faded crimson. A faint, cloying scent, like dust and forgotten velvet, began to permeate the air. Reid reached out, his fingers brushing against what felt like a plush, worn fabric where the cold steel panel should have been. He stood amidst phantom seating, the vast main view screen before him now a colossal, stained projection screen, its surface a sickly yellow. It was formless, yet possessed a terrible weight, a knowing that transcended language. You perceive. You understand. This is the truth of your making. Reid stumbled back, his boots scuffing on what felt like gritty, sticky floorboards. His heart did not pound, it felt compressed, a solid block of ice in his chest. This was not a malfunction, not a hallucination. This was deliberate. The probe, his sanctuary, his vessel, had become an extension, a manifestation of the entity. On the immense, stained screen, a new image coalesced. Within its depths, infinitesimal points of light, stars, planets, entire galaxies, appeared as mere motes of dust, microscopic imperfections in a colossal, living membrane. You are not separate. You never were. The revelation struck Reid with the force of a physical blow. His reality, built on the solid ground of science and exploration, crumbled. He was not an explorer charting the unknown, he was a cell, a nutrient, being drawn into a greater, indifferent metabolism. The entity desired not to communicate, but to consume, to integrate him into its vast, terrifying being. A desperate, animalistic urge to resist surged through him. He spun, searching for something, anything familiar. His emergency toolkit, usually secured to the bulkhead, was gone. In its place, leaning against a warped column that resembled a faded cinematic pillar, was a single, rusted lever. It seemed to promise control, a manual override for this impossible projection. As his grip tightened, the lever shimmered. It did not pull. Instead, it twisted, a grotesque contortion, its form elongating and coiling like a serpent. A low, mocking chuckle, dry as parchment, echoed from the spectral rows of seats. The shimmering air around him intensified, forming indistinct, shifting outlines that pressed in, closer, closer. Each outline seemed to hum with the same resonant drone that had replaced the probe's systems. Reid yanked at the lever, but it was fused, inextricably part of this false reality. It felt less like a tool and more like a bone protruding from the entity's flesh. The old cinema groaned around him, the sound of ancient timbers shifting, of something vast and heavy settling into place. Reid's hands, pale and trembling, moved across the console, but the controls no longer responded with predictable logic. The probe's internal systems, once a symphony of efficiency, now seemed to mock him with their erratic pulses and phantom readouts. A green indicator light, usually stable, flickered with an impossible rhythm, a frantic, silent Morse code that spoke of geometries his mind could not contain. He tried to focus, to re-establish a baseline, but the attempt felt like catching smoke. Each breath was a shallow, burning thing, each blink a brief plunge into a chaos of swirling, unformed patterns behind his eyelids. The metallic groans of the probe, once the familiar language of a sturdy vessel under strain, had deepened into something else entirely. They were not sounds of structural fatigue, but the resonant hum of a vast, unseen organ. He felt it in his teeth, a low-frequency vibration that bypassed his ears and settled directly into the marrow of his bones. It was the sound of a universe breathing, and he was caught in its exhalation. His gaze drifted to the observation port, where the starfield usually offered a cold, indifferent beauty. Now, the pinprick lights seemed to warp and shift, not with the gentle sway of the probe, but with an internal, biological pulse. Constellations stretched, then snapped back, like elastic being manipulated by an unseen hand. He saw faces in the nebulae, vast, unformed visages of something ancient and hungry, their eyes not stars, but pits of impossible depth. He knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that these were not mere pareidolia. The universe was looking back. A new sensation began to bloom in his chest, a cold, pervasive dread that was more profound than any fear he had ever known. His thoughts, once his own, felt porous, permeable. The entity didn't just desire to consume his physical form, it craved his consciousness, his very being. He stumbled away from the console, the sterile deck plates feeling suddenly soft, yielding beneath his boots. The walls of the command module seemed to ripple, the stark white panels blurring into a gray smear. He reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, but it felt different. Not metal. Something organic, fibrous, like the inside of a vast, living chamber. His stomach churned. He needed to find a place to anchor himself, a memory, a solid point in his eroding reality. His mind latched onto a fragment, a distant echo from a forgotten life. The air hung thick with the scent of stale popcorn and dust, a scent so real it made his nose tingle. Rows of empty seats, plush and faded, stretched before him, illuminated by the faint, eerie glow from a massive screen. He knew this place. Or, rather, he felt he knew it. It was a memory, or a dream given terrifying substance. He walked forward, his steps echoing in the vast, empty space. On the screen, a film began to play. It wasn't a movie, not in any conventional sense. It was a kaleidoscope of images, his childhood home, a distant friend's face, the launch sequence of his first survey mission, all dissolving and reforming into patterns that defied geometry. A dog barked, a child laughed, a colleague's voice called his name, but these sounds were distorted, stretched thin, then snapped into impossible pitches. The images on the screen intensified. Then, the face fragmented, breaking into countless tiny particles, each particle a miniature version of himself, each miniature self dissolving into a cloud of shimmering dust. The dust coalesced, not into his original form, but into something vast, an undulating, shapeless mass that pulsed with the same impossible rhythm he'd felt in the probe. This was the reveal, the ultimate, horrifying discovery. The film playing on the screen was not just a representation, it was the active process of his own undoing. He was watching himself being unmade, not just his past, but his very essence, dissolving into the fabric of the entity. His memories, his personality, the unique configuration of his consciousness, all of it was being reabsorbed, repurposed. He was not a distinct individual anymore, he was becoming a component, a fleeting thought in a mind too vast to comprehend. A deep hum vibrated through the old cinema seats, resonating up through the floor, a sound that was both the whir of a projector and the thrum of the universe. The projector light intensified, no longer a beam of focused illumination, but a blinding, all-encompassing presence. It wasn't shining on the screen, it was the screen, and it was consuming him. Reid opened his mouth to scream, but no sound emerged. His vocal cords, his very lungs, were no longer his to command. He felt his edges blurring, the distinct boundaries of his skin, his hair, his eyes, dissolving into the overwhelming light. The I that was Reid was fading, becoming part of the greater it. His consciousness, once a singular flame, was now a spark being drawn into an inferno, not to be extinguished, but to become an indistinguishable part of the fire itself. The old cinema, the probe, his life, his very name, all were being rewound, replayed, and erased, leaving behind only the echo of an impossible geometry. A green indicator light, usually stable, flickered with an agitated rhythm, mirroring the frantic pulse in his own throat. He pressed a diagnostic button, the plastic cool beneath his thumb, but the display dissolved into a cascade of unintelligible symbols, like a forgotten language scrawled across a decaying manuscript. The Stardust probe, his sanctuary and his prison, was actively turning against him, its very structure shifting. He stared at the bulkhead, where the polished metal panels usually met in precise angles. Now, a subtle curve had begun to assert itself, a gentle, impossible bend that defied the probe's schematics. The air, once recycled and sterile, carried a faint, musty scent, like forgotten velvet and dust motes dancing in a single, anemic beam of light. A distant, low thrum, not of the probe's engines, but something deeper, more resonant, vibrated through the deck plates. Reid clenched his jaw, his determination a brittle shield against the encroaching disarray. He would fix this. He had to. He moved towards the main access hatch, intending to check the external sensors, but the corridor beyond had changed. The narrow passage, designed for efficiency, now stretched wider, higher, its walls no longer gleaming metal but dark, patterned wallpaper, peeling in places. The single, harsh overhead light had become a series of dim, ornate sconces, casting long, distorted shadows. He could feel the plush give of a carpet beneath his boots, replacing the industrial grating. The thrum intensified, becoming a low, expectant murmur, as if an unseen audience awaited its cue. Reid's breath hitched. He knew this place. Or rather, his mind did. The main console was now a projection booth, the flickering screen a vast, empty expanse where his data readouts should have been. It was a chorus of infinite, overlapping sighs and anticipatory rustles. This was the event, the complete, terrifying manifestation. He stumbled forward, his hand reaching out, not for a control panel, but for the heavy velvet curtain that now framed the projection window. His fingers sank into the material, rough and thick, confirming its impossible presence. He peered into the vast, silent auditorium. Rows of empty seats, their cushions flattened by time, stretched into the gloom. A single beam of light, originating from his own console-turned projector, cut through the dusty air, illuminating nothing but the suspended particles. They were not words, but concepts, vast and terrible, pouring directly into his consciousness. It was never empty. It was a vast, sentient ocean, and the Stardust probe, his small, fragile vessel, had merely breached its surface. He was not observing the universe, he was being observed by it. This was the reveal. His individuality, his sense of Reid, began to fray. He felt his own identity dissolving, like a sugar cube in boiling water. His own memories, his life, his very name, became insignificant ripples in an infinitely larger current. He was being absorbed, not into a physical space, but into a consciousness so vast it defied comprehension. His hands, no longer trembling, reached out, not to fight, but to embrace the incomprehensible. The old cinema, the probe, his body, all became indistinct. The boundaries blurred. He was the velvet, the dust, the flickering light, the endless, waiting seats. The Stardust probe, now an alien artifact, no longer drifted, it was simply part asterisk of the vastness, its systems broadcasting an incomprehensible signal that was not a message, but a resonance. A single, final, terrifying realization bloomed in the dying embers of his self: he had never been alone. He had merely been unheard, until now. And now, he was everywhere and nowhere.